Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kevin Barnett, and I'm joined with my colleague, Lauren Brier, and we're here to discuss overcoming the inflation crisis, the ins and outs of inflation relief for DOD contractors. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview here up front before we even get into introductions to let you know that we intentionally scheduled this in early April because we were anticipating, much like the rest of the industry, that DOD would have issued its guidance by now on how they were going to implement the NDAA. Unfortunately, DOD has not issued their guidance, and it now does not look like that guidance is going to be issued until after Congress appropriates money to be used to fund this new authority. If that is what you were waiting for us to discuss, I apologize. I will write a sternly worded email to the Secretary of Defense expressing our displeasure. At the same time, if you have no idea what I just said, you're in the right place, and we'll fully explain all of the ins and outs of what the NDAA said and what our other options are to battle the inflation issue that's confounding many contractors. That said, let's move on to introductions. As I mentioned, I'm Kevin Barnett. I'm counsel, and I help lead our claims and disputes practice in our government contracts group. I handle all sorts of REAs, claims, disputes, termination, convenience settlements. I litigate matters at the boards and at COFC, and aside from that, a full soup to nuts government contracts lawyer handling any kind of government contracts issue you may have. With me is Lauren Brier. Lauren, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I also co-chair the REA's Claims and Appeals Practice Group alongside with Kevin. I also assist our clients with suspension and debarment proceedings, ADR, litigation before the Court of Federal Claims, and bid protests. And just to give a little background on our firm, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
No, go ahead. You're good.
Oh, I was just going to say that, we also deal in various areas that surround government contracts practice, which includes audits and investigations, business transactions, mergers and acquisitions. We also have a labor and employment group, and areas relative to False Claims Act as well.
Yeah, we like to pin ourselves as a full service firm for government contractors and commercial businesses alike. What we're going to be talking about today is the issue of inflation in government contracts. Lauren's going to provide a brief overview of what that impact is and how it's affecting the day-to-day government contracting community. I'm going to give you the DOD inflation update, summarize the guidance memos, preview the NDAA authority and what we can expect out of that, and discuss extraordinary contractual relief and whether that's a legitimate path to recovery. Then Lauren is going to cover the GSA inflation memos, which give a different slant and provide some strategic thinking on how to approach procurements in this high inflationary environment. And then we're going to give some key takeaways and some price escalation, recovery, and mitigation strategies. So I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I just wanted to cover, the impact of inflation on government contractors. Although inflation has been coming down, it is still at near historic levels. In the past year, over the past 12 months, the consumer price index is up 6%, which measures the prices paid by the average U.S. consumer. The producer price index, which covers more the change over time in what domestic producers receive for their output, So it's a little bit more of a direct to the contractor price. That's been up 4.6%. And just to give you an idea of how these, historically, as you can see, 8.3% in April, that was unmatched since any time. It's about the time I was born, 40 years ago. So, we're really dealing in a time where a really unprecedented or historical period. And inflation plays out in a couple different ways in government contracts. It certainly drives up cost and sometimes price increases to the government. It can also impact contractor performance, financial performance, budget management, acquisition strategies. Inflation is really, it's not just impacting the bottom line of contractors, but it's really impacting what the government is able to purchase and the types of procurements it's offering, as well as how contractors can succeed in performing those. And one thing to remember is, inflation isn't a monolith. It affects different markets in different ways. It affects different contracts in different manners. So it's really important when thinking about inflation and thinking about ways that you can combat inflation on your contracts, really think about what market am I in? What industry am I in? For example, I think we're experiencing different types of inflation in Europe and different types of inflation in the United States. Even within the United States, there are some areas that are, having certain types of hyper-localized inflation, whereas other areas are having, recovering a little bit faster and inflation is coming down a little bit quicker. So that's just, again, something to keep in mind. It's also impacting contract types differently. And we're going to hear a lot about this when we talk about the DOD and GSA memos. In a fixed price contract, the risk is usually borne by the contractor, although that risk may be mitigated with an EPA clause. And cost type contracts, that risk is almost always borne by the government for inflation, although those tasks still must be private. They still must be reasonable, not private. And GSA scheduled contracts are kind of their own animal as well, as they usually are. In those cases, the contractor has some flexibility to change their offerings, and the contracts do include some version of an EPA clause. By an EPA clause, I mean an economic price adjustment clause. And we're going to get into exactly what that means in a few minutes. So there are a couple different ways where we're seeing this starting to bear out in the, in the real world. Lauren, you want to discuss these examples?
Sure. So one of the examples that we're dealing with, the Air Force has most recently been reporting that defense companies are making bids on new contracts that are significantly higher than expected due to rising inflation. It's also bleeding into procurement evaluations and the idea that when performing price reasonableness analyses, agencies should consider the use of inflation and possibilities of underbidding. If prices are undercutting during, significant rises in inflation, agencies obviously need to determine whether prices being bid are actually fair and reasonable. Normally, adequate price competition establishes price reasonableness, and this is normally the most commonly used technique that government uses to evaluate that. But as inflation is playing more and more into these types of bids, agencies are working now to compare, competitive published price lists. They're also looking at published market prices of commodities and similar indexes and like discount arrangements when determining whether bids are reasonable under the current status of inflation. And we've also cited too a case, if you have time to take a look, Regal Press Inc., which was before GAO, where it was a big protest over an agency's failure to actually use inflation in a price reasonableness analysis. So it's something to just keep in mind when bidding and, you know, when thinking about protesting a procurement. And go to.
So in response to all of this, the various agencies have issued a number of memos. DOD issued a number of memos. I know GSA issued memos. Also NASA, who we don't necessarily talk about, but they also issued a series of memos about how to address inflation. And most significantly, and I think what gave contractors the most hope is right around Christmas, President Biden signed the fiscal year 23 National Defense Authorization Act, which is the yearly, it's been passed every year for about 60 plus years, and it's often chock full of procurement policy. And one of the things that got in this year was a Section 822, which is a modification of contracts to provide extraordinary relief due to inflation impacts. It expands authority under Public Law 85804 to modify firm fixed price contracts facing increased costs solely due to inflation. And this really was what, you know, the whole contractor community was asking for. It was authority to, you know, ignore the allocation of risk that was the firm fixed price. It was, you know, ability to give relief without needing an EPA clause. It really presented that it was a unicorn type provision. So it set out, you know, we don't know a ton about it. It was only, you know, barely a page long. What we do know, though, is that it was going to provide relief, but it was going to be limited to DOD contractors only. It only extended this authority to the Secretary of Defense. It also extended the potential relief to subcontractors. And it allowed contractors to either assert claims on behalf of their subcontractors, or in kind of a unique, rare situation, it also allowed subcontractors to assert claims in their own right if their prime contractor did not pass through their claim. Also helpfully, it was expressly stated that no consideration would be required. That would mean that a contractor would not have to give up any rights to any rights to claims or REAs or anything like that, nor would they have to agree to an accelerated schedule or to any contract changes to be eligible for this relief. You know, it was just a matter of qualified, you were going to get some type of relief. We also know that it was, you know, this authority is going to last for a very limited amount of time. It's very Cinderella-esque. And at midnight, the clock's going to toll midnight at the end of the year. So the authority only goes through December 31st, 2023. In addition, the way the law was written, it provided discretionary authority, which is consistent with the nature of extraordinary contractual relief, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that means that the Department of Defense would have a lot of leeway, one way or the other, whether to grant this inflationary relief. And it increased the reporting threshold. So previously, any adjustment over $50,000 had to be approved at an assistant or deputy secretary level. That threshold increases tenfold to $500,000. And it also increases the congressional notification threshold from 25 million to 150 million. And of course, that's significant here because, you know, I think a lot of these adjustments would have been at a greater than $50,000 threshold. And getting an assistant secretary to sign off on every one would have been a little difficult. So that's the limited amount that we know about the NDA provision. Here's what we don't know. The NDA provision states that relief is available for increased costs due solely to inflation. What in the world does due solely to inflation mean? I think that you could take a very hard line on that and have that mean next to nothing. Since there are, any kind of macroeconomic market is going to have a lot of influences, and inflation isn't going to be the sole cause of any cost increase. There could be supply chain issues, lingering effects of COVID. So we're going to need DOD to sort out exactly what due solely to inflation means, and that gives them a lot of leeway whether to be generous or miserly with this relief. Another big what we don't know is appropriations. As you can imagine, there are a lot of companies who have faced losses or cost increases due to inflation in the past year or two. And DOD doesn't necessarily have extra money lying around. And so this additional authority was couched as it would require its own appropriation. Despite passing the NDA last Congress, that Congress did not enact any appropriations to fund this new authority. The new Congress had a hard enough time electing a speaker, and it does not appear that it is going to pass any appropriations for this authority anytime soon. So it's possible that this authority remains unfunded, and all the hopes and dreams we had when it was passed are shot. Related to that, and as I kind of mentioned at the top of the program, DOD was instructed to provide guidance on how it was going to implement this new authority within 90 days. However, that was couched in that it didn't have to provide that guidance until Congress appropriated money to fund the program. So without any congressional appropriations on the horizon, unfortunately, I feel a little duped myself that I'm no longer expecting any guidance on the process until those appropriations. And I say this as somebody who has spent the better part of 2 weeks furiously Googling and refreshing the Undersecretary of Sustainment and Acquisitions website and reading the ever so interesting Federal Register for this guidance that I really expected to be out by now. But we're going to have to change, pivot with the new facts, and it doesn't look like that guidance is coming out anytime soon. So where does that leave us? DOD still in, DOD's 2 memos are still in force, and they point us to a couple of different options. First, we could, raise our bids, and I realize that is easier said than done, because it is, still a very competitive market out there. Bids are still being input with razor thin margins and often competed on price, whether the government claims their best value or not. But that said, DOD told Congress that it expects companies to raise future bids, not only to account for inflation on those future contracts, but to recoup losses from firm fixed price contracts affected by inflation. So that is, that's one possible remedy. Another possible remedy is EPA clauses. An economic price adjustment clause, and Lauren's going to describe these in more detail later, allows for a price adjustment if a specific commodity or element goes up in price. You identify a specific index, and if that index increases or decreases by more than 10% or more than 20%, and that's baked in, the methodology is baked into the clause, it would cause the price to change. Another way, this is the September memo, went in there and said that another way that contracting officers can offer relief is through an adjustment to contract terms. And this is just standard changes clause, government contracting 101. The catch there is it is subject to adequate consideration. What is adequate consideration? That is something that you have to work out with the contracting officer. There could be a lot of types of relief there, and sometimes it's going to work for it. Sometimes it's going to work for a particular contract, and sometimes it'll just make things worse. There are some contracts where scheduling relief might be helpful. There are other contracts where, maybe revised service levels or including an EPA clause as part of an option exercise. These are all things that a contracting officer has the power to do, but is by no means required to do. In addition, there's also the thought of an REA or claim. The first DOD memo back in May very clearly told contracting officers to reject any REA or claims based solely on inflation. So we got that dagger, it cut our heart out. But REA or claims can still be successful and still can recover cost increases due to inflation if you can successfully frame them as a change or a delay. And what I mean by that is if a government change caused you to price an item months after your initial bid, and now the price of that item has gone up due to inflation, you should be able to recover that higher price item that you now have to purchase months later because of that government change or delay. The fifth kind of area the DOD guidance has suggested as a possible option is extraordinary contractual relief. This is what the type of relief that the NDA expanded the authority to specifically include inflation. DOD's September memo specifically mentioned the possibility of recovery as under extraordinary contractual relief. And that's it was really outside the box thinking when that popped up in the memo. So taking a step back, extraordinary contractual relief under Public Law 85-804 is an authority that dates back to the 70s, if not sooner, and it grants certain secretaries and department heads the ability to enter into, amend, or modify contracts without regard to other provisions of law related to making, performing, amending, or modifying contracts whenever the president considers such an action would facilitate the national defense. So really soak that in there. It means that they get to amend a contract regardless of whether there's a law that says they can, and regardless of any other provision of law. They can throw the FAR out as far as consideration, as far as Anti-Deficiency Act, whatever. Now, to qualify under, or to get relief under Public Law 85-804, The contractor must submit a detailed request to the CO explaining the facts warranting the adjustment, the contractor's financial condition, and information about contract performance. And again, this is because the purpose of Public Law 85804 is not necessarily to make a contractor whole on a particular contract. It's certainly not to make sure a contractor makes as much profit on a particular contract, but to relieve a contractor from unintended consequences. And it may be a situation where they're losing money on a contract and they're going to go out of business, and then the government is worried about losing a critical member of the defense industrial base, or they want to make sure that there are multiple options for a different part so that a monopoly situation is occurring. So they really need to know about the whole picture to the contractor, not really just the microcosm of the particular contractor contracts where you're asking for relief. So this type of relief comes in 3 different ways: contractual adjustments, advance payments, or exercise of residual powers. And it should be available for inflation cost increases. So DOD September memo indicated that DOD was willing to entertain the idea that it could use this authority in the right circumstance for inflation. The NDAA stepped in and explicitly expanded the authority to more clearly cover inflation. And you could read that one of 2 ways. The glass half empty among us will say that if they had to pass that NDAA provision, then that probably means that we didn't have the authority without that provision. The glass half full of us say that was just a belt and suspenders approach, and that the authority is available with or without the NDAA provision. And that's particularly important because the NDAA provision is available only to DOD, whereas extraordinary contractual relief is available to a number of agencies outside of DOD. Now, that said, no agency outside of DOD has expressed, to my knowledge, any willingness to entertain these types of claims, but it's something to think about. So if you're considering a contractual adjustment, which would include, amendment without consideration, these are typically available, as I was talking about before, when an important contractor's productivity ability is impaired, when the government action causes the contractor's loss, and to claim one of these, you're going to be asking the CO. You're going to need the essential facts, the arguments entitling the contractor to the adjustment, what obligations have been made under the contract, how much you've been paid, how much you owed, how much work do you have left, really giving the contracting officer and his higher ups, because this would need to be approved by several levels above him, an idea about why is this in the government's best interest to amend your contract in this way? Why is that relief so important? They can also provide, advance payments, which is particularly important or considered useful and appropriate for small businesses. This relief can also be used if the other types of powers, when necessary and appropriate, you can kind of craft additional relief. This is often used to provide indemnification provisions, which would otherwise be a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Overall, it's been used sparingly. This authority is not something that happens every day or even every year, but desperate times call for desperate measures. So there's, this is a unique way that DOD kind of raised and Congress has raised as maybe a contractor's best opportunity to get relief for inflation without consideration. GSA has also offered.
So I will, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry about that, Kevin. So I will take it from here. So GSA is another agency that offered some guidance on inflation and the impact it's having on their scheduled contractors. So most recent guidance was issued back in March 17, 2022. Again, focused on GSA schedule holders, and it recognized that various factors are continuing to impact the global economy as well as GSA contracts in particular. It has since suspended the enforcement of limits on how often scheduled contractors can increase pricing, which has played into negotiations of adding in EPA clauses to particular contracts as well. It's also allowed contractors to increase their GSA schedule prices more frequently than otherwise permitted. There was also a September alert that came out that has since highlighted several strategies and guidance for the community to address inflation. There's 3 elements to this that I'll go into in more detail, but the first one is the use or more common use of EPA clauses, leveraging more streamlined procurement vehicles to reduce procurement lead times, and then also awarding shorter duration contracts. So focusing first on EPA clauses, key considerations to take into account for the use and development of these clauses is the funding that is available. The other is to understand that EPA clauses can provide for an upward and a downward adjustment. There's various formats, and agencies have the freedom to craft versions of an EPA clause as they see fit. EPA clauses are often linked to market indices, so this index should be monitored throughout performance, and it should also be changed through a bilateral modification if it no longer meaningfully represents the market conditions impacting your contract in particular. Increases may trigger other contract obligations, so it's really important to keep that into account. One of the examples we provided here is an increase in your contract price can obviously trigger the requirement to use a small business subcontracting plan. So it's very important to understand, the thresholds that apply to your contract as you're negotiating any inclusion of an EPA clause or price increase. The alert also provided some helpful sample language. So if you're considering negotiating an EPA clause, I highly suggest you take a look at the GSA guidance and the sample language that they provided there. It's quite helpful and gives you a more specific understanding of what these actually look like. And just for specific GSA guidance, there's 2 clauses that govern
Lauren, did we lose you again? All right. So when crafting EPA clauses, there are 2 things that you really want to look at. Material tracking and what the adjustment looks like. So when you consider material tracking, that's when you're looking at what materials do we think are going to be affected? Is the price that I'm really worried about changing here, is that steel? Is that labor? Is it electronic? What is the price? And making clear what the price per unit at award was, because that's how we're going to measure the price adjustment. How does it go from here to here? And what's the relevant index? We kind of looked at 2 kind of big picture indexes at the top of the hour. Those are probably not great indices if you're looking for a particular commodity. There are much more direct and much more focused indices that will, track the price of steel, track the price of copper, on a much, more targeted basis. And those tend to be the types of indices that you want to use because they just provide a better indication, and ancillary stuff doesn't get caught up in the noise. The other part of the EPA clause that's important is the adjustment. when is it going to go? When is your price going to change? A lot of times they'll set, if it goes up or down by 10% or 15%, that's when we're changing. And you usually have to, let them know, is this, if it changes 10% over year, month over month, what's that time period? There's obviously going to be some fluctuation in the price, and that's anticipated. It's these wild fluctuations that we've been dealing with for the past year or so that you are hoping to avoid with this. And then related to that trigger time period, excuse me, you also have the contractor notification timing. How often do I need to report that? How often do I need to report that the value has jumped? Every month, every 2 months. You don't want this to become a burden, but you do want to make sure it's often enough to meaningfully capture price increases in time to make a difference. Here are some additional resources. Defense Acquisition University, you can Google it online, has 2-hour-long, I think they're about an hour long each, about constructing EPA clauses. They're very informative and really, dig deep into the nitty-gritty of the things I just talked about. Lauren, you back?
I am back. I apologize. I'm dealing with some technical difficulties over here. So GSA guidance, one of the main factors that they're looking at is also streamlining acquisitions to, help relieve some inflationary impacts. They are touting the importance of speed in acquisition, and they're noting the use of existing GSA purchasing program vehicles to make it easier than ever to streamline these procurement actions. And the idea there is that by streamlining and speeding up the procurement process, they're reducing the impact of inflation, by it taking additional time to actually procure and award bids. So if GSA is able to use a pre-existing procurement vehicle, they can award contracts much faster and reduce the impact of inflation. So some of the procurement vehicles that they're encouraging be used, one is GSA multiple award schedules, one is the OASIS Small Business and OASIS 8A procurement vehicle, also looking at 8A STARS, VETS 2, and Polaris. They're also looking at structuring simplified procurements. So GSA has come out and they're beginning to encourage their contracting officers not to use FAR 15 procedures, with the idea that those evaluation procedures are much more lengthy. And they also are encouraging their CEOs not to use unnecessarily complicated evaluation schemes to again streamline this process. They're also suggesting to contracting officers that they use oral presentations to address offer capabilities, again, to keep that procurement process limited to abate inflationary impacts. So another point to be made from GSA's guidance that came out is that they're encouraging contracting officers to consider shorter durations of contracts. So at GSA, it's quite common for contracts to be awarded for a total period of performance like up to 5 years. And sometimes for PBS, specifically in the facilities area, it's not unusual to establish BPAs up to 10 years. So in times of economic uncertainty, the GSA is truly encouraging their CEOs to reduce the time period relative to their contracts to abate risk and to allow contractors to more reasonably predict their costs. And GSA is also acknowledging that longer contracts in this type of arena are obviously posing a significant risk to contractors. So they are across the board recommending that there be a reduction in periods of performance. So some of the price escalation strategies that we try to recommend to our clients pre-award The first big one is obviously monitor your pricing carefully during the bidding phase. That is, the most important. And one of the other things to take into consideration is looking at quotes and seeing, when it's possible to lock those in. You would want to do that as soon as possible. Another thing to take into account is, building risk into your proposed prices and documenting that consideration. DOD has said that it expects to pay higher prices, but obviously, when your bid is high, it could make it less competitive. So, finding the right balance there and the price that is reasonable is really important before submitting a bid in this type of atmosphere. And requesting an economic price adjustment clause, we have often recommended to our clients more recently that if it's possible, if they have an amicable relationship with the CO or they feel a willingness to negotiate an EPA clause be added to a procurement, then, take a shot at doing so. Or including a contingency to cover price escalations, to put language into the contract to ensure that you are covered, post-bid and post-award for any unexpected or unanticipated increase in costs. Like I said previously, always review subcontractor and supplier quotes for escalation terms. This is really important. Make sure that you're covered on the back end in case there's, some significant material price increase, and that, you're able to either recover that from the customer or negotiate that down with the supplier after the fact. Another recommendation is limiting the length of time your bid price is valid. You don't want to leave that open-ended, obviously, with the inflationary impacts that are ongoing. So, you want to make sure that any quote that you put out, any bid prices that go out there, there's a distinct limitation on that price and the need for it to be readjusted.
And we understand a lot of times that, whether or not the government is willing to put an EPA clause, they have not been nearly as amicable and willing to play ball with contractors that we had expected. And how long your bid is valid for sometimes isn't up to you. It's required by the procurement, which might counsel you to take a long, hard look on making those no bid decisions. Assess the risk of having to keep your price open for 60, 90, 180 days when you're really only comfortable doing it for 15 or 30. Which again, it's unfortunate advice and not really helping anyone to tell you to no bid contracts. But if you're not comfortable with the price options or the price escalation strategies that are available, that sometimes that's the retreat is the better part of valor. After you bid and have the award, that's a different story.
Yeah, so some of the recommendations that Kevin and I provide to our clients relevant to post-award escalation strategies is checking your contract first to see if there is an EPA clause, change in law and tax clauses that may provide for an equitable adjustment. Obviously, that's best case scenario, right? If that clause is already in there, that gives you leverage for negotiation, reaching out to the CO and trying to resolve that issue. Also focusing on SCA wage determinations or federal minimum wage requirements. This may also come into play as well. The big point to be made is securing fixed prices with subcontractors with confirmation that they comply with their supply obligations. So like I said previously, you want to keep in mind of when you really need to nail down a quote and confirm that the price is the price with your subcontractor. Otherwise, you're finding yourself getting revised quotes consistently with an increase. And you want to make sure that you nail those quotes down as soon as you can, and so that it fits into your schedule and you're not trying to chase after money after the fact. Another thing to take into consideration is accelerating or deferring purchase of material subject to escalation. in some cases, and particularly in construction, it's important to purchase supplies early and store on site if necessary. If you're looking at the market and you think that, you know, lumber cost increases are going to jump, or concrete, you know, you want to take that into account and make sure that you're purchasing on time and early. And it may just be better to, you know, and the cost will remain low if you're able to just store it on site to prevent any future increase in costs. You also want to closely scrutinize any government direction for potential changes or delays. This comes into play, you know, always make sure that any changes that are impacting your contract or stop work orders, something like that, that it's coming from the contracting officer, and that you're providing them with immediate notice of how that is actually going to impact not only the performance period, but as well as your material increases in supplies, and, you know, maybe the supply chain, how that is going to impact a particular material that may be needed for performance. So keeping the government apprised of any of these types of impacts tied to changes is really, really important. GSA memo actually came out and stated that compensation is appropriate when the government delays push work into a period when higher costs are encountered. So if you can tie any form of delay impact driven by the government, that's a much better position to be in, because you are in a better negotiation position for recovery of costs or time. Another thing to keep in mind is requesting changes in the schedule or other contract terms. Like I said, if you believe that inflation is impacting your contract, there's no harm in requesting a change. It's just want to make sure that it is done timely. You don't want to sit on your hands and then, you know, getting close to the close of performance and saying, hey, well, you know, inflation impacted this, this, and this. We'd like to request a cost recovery. The agency is likely to come back and say, well, you should have, you know, apprised us of this issue, you know, right away. So just make sure that you keep the agency on notice of any impacts. You want to determine what types of relief would help the current situation on a contract by contract basis. Always make sure that you're reviewing your contracts and considering any non-price changes to the contractual terms. And, you know, the contracting officer, a lot of it is highly dependent on funding, but there has in certain instances been a willingness of contracting officers to negotiate changes to a contract tied to inflation, especially if the changes are being driven by the government. So keep that in mind, you know, that it can never hurt to try to negotiate with the CO to get an adjustment on the back end.
So we have one question that's, you know, highlights some of the thorny issues that contractors find themselves in with this inflationary environment and the unclear relief options. You know, in this hypothetical, you've been notified that you're the apparent low bidder on an upcoming award. The contracting team, however, is awaiting funding, and they're not sure exactly when it will arrive. You were diligent and you listened to our advice and put a reasonable bid. You set a date for when your bid was valid, but it's running out shortly. You obviously don't want to rebid and you know, lose the contest, and the government certainly doesn't want to conduct a new competition. But what do you do to make sure that you're protected from, you know, cost increases if this goes another 30, 60, 90, 180 days? And that's certainly a tough question. I think, you know, maybe your best option there is seeing if the contracting officer will agree to you know, some kind of EPA clause, or give you a handshake agreement. But those are probably unlikely. I think the government is going to want that you just extend the pricing. And in that case, I think I might do it in short bites and sell the government that will extend it for, you know, 15 days or 30 days if you feel comfortable your pricing can hold. And, you know, obviously, depending on what your margins were and what the market is. But I would certainly ask the government what kind of relief you could negotiate before agreeing to it. But that's gonna, the government's not gonna like that, and it's probably unlikely to go with any of those ideas. So thank you for that. Thank you for that thorny thought exercise. And I apologize for the lawyerly it depends answer. So the other strategy, and we hoped that we were going to talk a lot more about this, but coming back to the NDAA, well, we don't have the guidance out yet. We do know the authority is there, and if Congress does get around to appropriating money, it might be a huge relief. So while we're waiting for that, I don't think I would, do anything drastic or spend thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars on consultants. But I would start trying to track costs, increased costs solely by inflation. Compare project cost increases to relevant price indices, even if you don't have an EPA clause. Keep records of both. Track the bids that you get, the different quotes. You also can use the NDAA relief as an opportunity to negotiate with subcontractors. As I mentioned, the NDAA authority is very interesting that it did extend to subcontractors. So there's a possibility that you could, very reasonably go to them with a let's share the pain type offer with the promise or hope of shared relief. And I think most importantly, make sure everyone's keeping their fingers crossed that Congress does come through with this much needed appropriations and DOD can issue this guidance, and we can get some inflation relief. But explore other options too. There are a lot of hurdles we have to go over. We need Congress to appropriate the funds. We need DOD to issue the guidance quickly. We're up against an end of the year clock that is running out quickly, and whatever application process is not going to be a rubber stamp. It's going to be some kind of onerous process where, there are going to be winners and losers, and they're not going to give it to everyone who applies. So don't put all your eggs in this basket, but keep your fingers crossed that those eggs do hatch. With all of that in mind, we got some price escalation traps, things to keep in mind as you're trying to navigate all of this. We told you, I think we mentioned 2 or 3 times, the importance of framing any kind of relief you can find in terms of government delay or government changes, and that's still the best advice at your best chance of getting any recovery. That said, if you do couch your relief and say, we have all these cost increases and they're due to, this government delay or this government change, that may undercut your ability to later say those costs were solely due to inflation. Just something to keep in mind. Also echoing, what Lauren was talking about, on the front end with getting supplier costs and hammering and really digging in and getting commitments. I've seen a number of these claims get rejected in a, I consider it a pretty disingenuous way, but it is what it is, because the contractor didn't go above and beyond to take all steps possible to secure pricing. And the contractor delayed, maybe the subcontractor wasn't needed to the second half of the project, and the contractor delayed securing those pricing, and then pricing went up. And I've seen the government reject paying out on delay claims for those increased costs, because arguing that, oh no, the government, the contractor should have locked down that pricing right away. Another trap that I would just, not not worth belaboring, but we've talked a lot about fixed price contracts. Cost type contracts are not immune from all of this. While the risk is still is on the government and not the contractor for inflation, the contractor still bears the obligation of proving the reasonableness of its costs. And I can definitely see when some of these contracts start to be audited at in a few years, in retrospect, DCAA or DCMA or the agency questioning the reasonableness of some of these increased costs, because again, contractors didn't do enough to secure their pricing at the beginning. So what does this mean? I have no magic wand. I have no silver bullet. I don't even have any additional analogies I can use. But there are some things you can do to try and recover, depending on your circumstances. Excuse me. For the inflation. You can submit an REA asking for relief under an applicable clause, an EPA clause, the Service Contract Act, the changes clause. That's going to be your strongest. Or submit a claim if they can be linked to government action. Again, it's even if the government action was just pushing out when you purchase things or pushing out when you had to purchase things. Oh, the government changed this from a red knob to a green knob, and so I couldn't buy the green knob until 6 months later, and it costs more. That could be the basis of a change. Also, this isn't recovery, but mitigation. Identify ways to limit the contract term. Strict enforcement of options. If they don't meet their pre-option exercise notice and they don't meet the explicit terms of option exercise, you can get out of that option, and it's a breach by the government. If you're on a schedule, GSA has offered a few options to reduce the items available or to increase the costs. You also can refuse to agree to bilateral modifications. All of these are ways that you can try and stem the bleeding if that's the issue. And the big elephant in the room, the novel idea that I touted, but I haven't seen a lot of people jump on, and is seeking extraordinary contractual relief under Public Law 8504. It wouldn't be appropriate in all circumstances, but I really do believe it would be granted under the correct circumstances. So with that, I apologize for anyone who came here looking for the DOD guidance discussion. We really wanted to have that discussion. But hopefully you got some good information about what still can be done to, navigate this inflationary period and recover some inflationary increased costs, or to mitigate any of those losses in the future. Open up to anyone have any additional questions. All right, well, if you do feel free to email Lauren or I, and we can address any questions offline and answer them by email. We do really appreciate everyone joining today, and look forward to having you on as guests on future webinars. Thank you very much, and have a great day.